Let's take a look at revising and editing and figure out what the difference is between the two. Before we do that, let's talk about the writing process and the parts of the writing process. So we know we have brainstorming and planning and writing and revising and editing and publishing. We have all of those parts of the writing process. Writing is recursive. It's never complete. You should always be reviewing and revising things that you are preparing and writing. Professional writers write and rewrite their works numerous times before they publish them, and there are times that professional writers will go back to something that's already published and revise it and redo it as well. So revisiting the revision stage multiple times throughout the process is expected, and it's a really good habit of strong writers. So you may brainstorm and then start some writing and then go in and revise and then go straight back to brainstorming and then go from brainstorming to writing and then revise again, then go to edit. And then when you're done with the edit, then you're like, well, maybe I should go back and write some more. And then you go back and write. It's a very recursive process. It's not a circle. It's more of a back and forth. So in this class, I'm asking you to work your way through the entire writing process. And here we are at revising, and I want to make sure you know the difference between editing and revising, because often I ask students to do some revisions, and what I get from them is editing. So let's look at editing and what it is first, and then talk about how it's different than revising. So editing deals with a paper at a sentence level. You're examining each sentence in the paper and making changes as needed. So you're addressing your grammar, your punctuation, and the mechanics. You're looking at whether or not something is spelled incorrectly, whether or not that should have a comma there or a semicolon. You're looking at your grammar, are you using the correct tense and voice throughout. You're also looking at concerns with your citations, your in-text citations, and looking at your reference page and making changes. If a teacher or an instructor has given you feedback and telling you that an in-text citation is incorrect or your reference page is incorrect, then those are editing changes, not revision changes. And editing doesn't change the content of the paper as a product. It just changes the writing of the paper. So that's editing in a nutshell. So let's take a look at the difference with what revision is. Revision deals with the paper as a whole. It examines the paper and looks at the organization, the support that you're providing or the evidence you're providing, and takes a look at the argument that you are making and decides whether or not changes need to be made there. So your revision is changing those types of things. You're going to ask questions of your paper. You're going to look at it and ask more in-depth questions. This is where you might expand some ideas. You may take a look at certain parts of it and expand something. It's going to involve sometimes removing entire sections or paragraphs, or maybe adding those things, looking and adding extra evidence or adding extra ideas, or perhaps producing a counter argument. Revision really offers you a chance to clarify vague ideas and to fix confusing text or confusing parts of your paper. So revision is different than editing. Revision is taking a look at the structure of the paper, the organization, the support, the ideas, the arguments that you're making, and making changes to those things. Editing is looking at it on a sentence level and making changes to your grammar, your punctuation, your citations, your format, those things. So for your midterm and your final in this course, you're asked to do a revision project. You're revising papers. So you need to take it and look at each thing and make revision changes for your paper. So that can be a big task, because how do you make big revisions to a paper that you've already written? So there are 4 ways that you can look at it. You can add things, you can limit things, you can switch things, or you can transform things. So I'm going to go through each one of those with you and help you a little bit with knowing what are some options and maybe some ideas for revision for you. So let's look at adding first. That's where you want to expand your focus. You're going to expand what you're talking about and what you're looking at in your paper. And here are 4 ways that you could accomplish that. You could do a keyword brainstorming. That's where you go through your paper and you pick some keywords. And you want to brainstorm additional ways that you might be able to expand your paper. So in other words, you're looking for maybe a way to add another section or another part of your argument. The next one is journalistic questions. You want to ask who, what, when, where, why, and how. And you do that in different points of your essay. That way that you can look at it and perhaps see if you need to expand in some places when you say, well, what does that mean? Or why is that there? Or how does that work? And then you can expand further on there. You can expand by trying perhaps a new intro or a conclusion. Just sit down and write a completely different introduction or a completely different conclusion and make a revision in that way. Or you can try switching them. You can try switching your conclusion and your introduction and tweaking them a little bit and seeing if maybe something like that would make a good revision. Or another one for expanding the focus, you can add some new ideas between different lines or different paragraphs. So kind of look at the paper and see if there is something that's missing that will help connect a couple ideas and adding some new things in there. So those are ways to expand or add to your paper. So next on the list for strategies for revision was to limit. That's to narrow your focus. So maybe you have some broad ideas or broader implications in your paper, and you want to narrow those things down. So here's 4 techniques to help you do some narrowing. The first thing you can do is a says does outline. That's where you go through your paper and you know what each paragraph says and what it does. So you go through and you mark down what the content of it is and then what it does, what's its structure or organizational point in the paper. And then you'll see whether or not maybe you have some things that are repeated or unnecessary. So that's a good way to figure out if perhaps there's something in there that really doesn't need to be in there, or you've kind of repeated yourself twice. Another way is a flow chart. Create a chart that shows the organization of your paper and can see if anything is repetitive or unnecessary or needs to be taken out. You could try the approach called the 1-inch frame, where you isolate just one section of your paper and you figure out if that section is clearly explained. So you can just kind of focus on one paragraph or one little part of a paragraph and see if you need to make any changes there. And another one for limit is the elevator speech, which is another word, essentially another way to say an abstract. Compose a real quick 1-minute speech explaining what your paper's about. And consider if you've covered all the parts of that paper in your little speech that you have written. The next strategy for revision is switch. And for switch, that's when you want to change your perspective. So a way to do that is maybe start in a new place. Try starting your paper from a different part, or reorganize the structure of your paper. Take that thesis statement. You've got points 1, 2, 3, and 4. Maybe attack them in 3, 2, 4, and 1. Just kind of start in a different place. Another way to change perspective is a contrast. Write a contrasting paragraph to the topic that you're presenting in the paper, and then consider whether or not you have written it in a clear and concise way. So if you write it from the other point of view, does it still make sense? Have you covered everything you need to cover? And another way to focus on changing the perspective is a purpose audience analysis. That's where you consider each point as a writer and a reader and determine if the audience is properly informed about the paper in a very clear way. So make sure you're not just the writer, but you're also the reader there. And the last strategy for revision is transform. And this is where you just kind of change the whole paper and transform it into something totally different. Ways to do that: audience, change your audience, write to a different group of clientele. So if you're writing a paper about something that has to do with nursing and your audience is nursing students, maybe change your audience and write to doctors, write to the general public. That's a way to change the entire paper, is to change your format. That changes your background, that changes where you need definitions, that changes how you explain things a little differently because your audience is different. Another way to transform your paper would be the save one. That's where you choose one line from a paragraph, you save it, and you rewrite the entire paragraph over just to see how it would be if you wrote it differently. In some people, and sometimes you can do this with the entire paper. Another way to go about changing it all is conclusion is best. That's where you use your conclusion as your introduction and you rewrite your entire paper from this new starting point. There's transform it all, or transform it and changing it all is a big task, but sometimes they're fun, especially if you feel like you've written an excellent paper and you need to figure out a way to revise it for this project. It's a good way to do it. All right, so let's look at the helpful hints that I have when it comes to revising. And these are ways to step back from the paper and figure out how you're going to do revision. If you have just finished writing the paper and you immediately go into revision because it's due 10 minutes later, your revisions usually aren't going to be as good as they should be. You need to give yourself a little time. So that's what I call the cooling off period. You're going to take some time, you're going to step away from the paper, give yourself a day or two, and then go back to it, reread it, and then be like, yeah, I'm definitely not clear here. The structure's not the best. The order I'm presenting these ideas is perhaps not the best way to do it. Another helpful hint for revising is to actually revise from a hard copy. And I know not everybody has access to printer, but you can always go to the college and print off. But we stare at these screens and we look at these screens and everything kind of jumbles together. Take a physical copy of it, go print off that paper, and take a nice colored pen, any color you want, doesn't have to be red. I always do mine in purple. Pick a color, get a pen, and sit down and write all over that thing. Revise it, make changes, draw lines, draw arrows, mark things out. And then take and look at that paper and retype it in based on that. And that's a really good way to do a revision. Another helpful hint is to read that baby aloud. Read it out loud as if you were giving a speech to somebody or telling somebody all about it. You're going to realize as you read it aloud where some of those mistakes are, where you're not very clear in what you're saying or what you're doing or how you're communicating what it is that you're saying. And then, just so you know, that's an excellent way to do proofreading as well. Using feedback, going back in and looking at any instructor feedback that you've received, any feedback you received from peers. Perhaps you've asked somebody in your life to read the paper, a roommate, a friend, a colleague. You've asked them to read it and they've given you some feedback. Go in and take a look at that and use that to help you make some revisions. Using a reverse outline. If you're not sure what a reverse outline is, you can go back to my video on outlining and I'll talk about how to do a reverse outline. But that's a great way to go back in and make sure that you've got everything you need. And then when you realize there's some things that might be lacking, you use that to go in and revise. And the last helpful hint is the old-fashioned cut and paste. And that's again where you're going to have to print off your paper. You're going to take that paper and the first thing you're going to do is you're going to cut that paper up into paragraphs. And you're physically going to move those paragraphs around. You're going to lay those papers out and those sections out onto a table and you're going to move them around because you can physically move paragraph 2 to paragraph 1 and you're going to look at it. And maybe you'd revise that way. You can get even more in depth and go in and do line by line and break things down and move things around line by line. So that's another great way to do some revision.